5 waves, not one shot across the bow, not a single symbolic missile fired into empty desert for the cameras. 5 separate, coordinated waves of ballistic missiles launched at Israel in a single night. And the most powerful media apparatus on earth spent the next 24 hours arguing about a congressional budget vote. That is where we are. That is the gap between what is actually happening in the world and what you are being told. And this story, the story of Iran doing exactly what it promised to do, of Israel crossing a line it was explicitly warned not to cross, and of the President of the United States responding by telling his closest regional ally to stand down and go home. This story matters more to your life, your security, and your tax dollars than anything else being covered right now. So let's rip the curtain back. Let's go through what actually happened, what it actually means, and who is actually pulling the strings. Because the picture that emerges when you put all the pieces together is not the picture you are getting anywhere else. And the American people have been kept in the dark on this for far too long. If this kind of unfiltered, no-spin coverage is what you've been looking for, subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell, drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Israel backs down, or does this spiral into something America cannot afford to walk into? I read every comment. Your voice matters in this conversation. Here's what the timeline actually looks like, because the sequence of events is everything. About a week before these missile strikes shook Israel to its foundations, the Israeli military issued evacuation orders for Dahieh, the dense southern suburb of Beirut that serves as a significant Hezbollah operational hub. The moment those evacuation orders went out, Iran read them for exactly what they were: a signal that a strike was coming. And Iran responded the way nations respond when they actually mean what they say. They moved their missile launchers into position. They issued a public, unambiguous warning: strike Dahieh and we will hit northern Israel. We are not threatening. We are informing you of the consequences. Get your people out. What happened next was a brief moment where American intervention appeared to work. Trump reportedly called Netanyahu and told him in terms that were reportedly quite colorful to back off from Beirut. The evacuation orders were canceled. The crisis appeared to de-escalate. And then, a week later, a building in Dahieh was struck. Not leveled, not a mass casualty event, but a deliberate, identifiable military action against a neighborhood that Iran had publicly, explicitly, operationally marked as a red line. Iran's response was not delayed or hedged or moderated by diplomatic caution. 5 waves, approximately 20 ballistic missiles, videos of impact circulating on social media before the Israeli government had finished drafting its first statement. Iron Dome systems were activated across the country. And the footage that was circulating was not footage of missiles being intercepted cleanly over the water. Some of them were getting through. Hospitals began moving patients underground. The U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem ordered all staff to shelter in place. And then Donald Trump spoke, not with the fury of a man who just watched an allied nation absorb a ballistic missile barrage, not with the language of retaliation and solidarity that has characterized American responses to Iranian military action for the past 4 decades. He went to Fox News, the administration's own preferred communications channel, and said that Iran had fired its missiles. That was enough, and Iran should get back to the table and make a deal. He told Axios he was not happy about Israel's strike on Beirut and that the United States had not coordinated with it. He told Israeli media, Channel 12, that no one was hurt in the missile attack, that he did not want Netanyahu to respond, that both sides had taken their shots, and this is a sentence that deserves to be on the front page of every newspaper in America, that the United States was very close to a final deal with Iran, and he did not want it blown up by what was happening on the ground, that is, the sitting president of the United States in 2026, publicly putting diplomatic distance between American policy and Israeli military action while missiles are still being cleaned off Israeli streets. Whatever your politics, whatever you believe about the Middle East, that sentence represents a shift in American foreign policy that has not happened in decades. Now here is the piece of this story that has received almost no serious coverage in mainstream American media, and it may be the most consequentially underreported development of this entire escalation. 2 nights before the missile strikes that shook Israel, Iran reportedly struck a target at the United States Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Not a symbolic strike, not a near miss designed for television, a precision hit on something that people with direct knowledge of the situation have described, without being able to disclose the full classified details, as extremely valuable, essentially irreplaceable, and worth well over $1 billion in capability and infrastructure, something that rendered an aspect of American military capacity in the Gulf inoperable. And the thing that reportedly sent American military command into something close to disbelief was not the strike itself, it was the targeting. Here's the question that changes everything. How did Iran know that target existed? How did they identify its precise location? How did they understand its operational capabilities well enough to destroy it with the precision required? Because the answer being discussed in intelligence circles is that Iran could not have done that alone. That level of precision targeting against an asset the United States believed was effectively concealed required intelligence support from either Russia or China, most likely involving satellite imagery at a resolution and analytical depth that no Iranian intelligence asset operating independently could have produced. That is not editorial commentary. That is the internal assessment being shared among people who understand what was hit and what would be required to hit it. Understand what that implies. Iran is not operating as an isolated regional actor throwing ballistic missiles at the sky. Iran is operating as a node in an intelligence and military network that includes 2 nuclear powers, one of which has some of the most sophisticated satellite reconnaissance capabilities on Earth, and the other of which has been systematically expanding its intelligence footprint across the Middle East for years. A strike on Iran is therefore not just a strike on Iran, it is a provocation against that broader network, and more immediately, it means that the classified capabilities America has deployed in the Gulf, the systems and assets that U.S. military planners believed were invisible to adversaries, have been penetrated at a depth that the Pentagon did not anticipate. Every American service member stationed at every Gulf installation, from Qatar to Kuwait to the UAE, is operating in an environment that just became measurably, demonstrably more dangerous. And the American public has been told, essentially, nothing about it. If you are still watching and you haven't subscribed yet, right now is the moment. This channel is doing the work that the major networks are not subscribed. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening in the Middle East, and drop your take in the comments below. Here is where the story takes a turn that should alarm every American who still believes their government is acting in America's interests rather than Israel's. For weeks before this escalation erupted, a Pakistani diplomatic back channel had been operating with unusual urgency and unusual optimism. Islamabad was functioning as an active intermediary between Washington and Tehran, not just hosting preliminary talks, but reportedly working toward a concrete framework agreement that could formally end the state of war that has defined U.S.-Iran relations since 1979. Pakistani sources with direct knowledge of the process were describing the prospects as genuinely positive, not cautiously optimistic, genuinely confident, and Trump confirmed the substance of this in public in real time, telling multiple outlets that a final deal with Iran was very close and that he expected it to be signed within days. Now stack that against something that was published by the New York Times over the same period, that the Pentagon had dramatically escalated its counterintelligence operations against Israel, specifically because Israeli intelligence agencies were conducting aggressive espionage operations against American communications, trying to penetrate U.S. diplomatic channels to discover the contents of whatever deal Washington was building with Tehran. Israel was spying on the United States to find out what America was offering Iran in a peace agreement. The Pentagon's response was to leak the story publicly. A deliberate, calculated act of message sending that said, "We know what you are doing, and we are not going to pretend we don't." Hold those two facts alongside the timing of the Beirut strike, and the picture that emerges is damning. Israel's intelligence apparatus discovered that a deal was imminent. A deal that would end the war, freeze Israeli military operations in southern Lebanon, normalize a U.S.-Iran relationship that Israel has spent billions of dollars and decades of influence peddling to prevent, and fundamentally reshape the balance of power in a region Israel has long operated in with near-total American backing, and someone made a decision, someone in the Israeli security establishment or in the more extreme flanks of the coalition that Netanyahu depends on for political survival, chose to strike Dahaya, cross the line Iran had explicitly drawn, force Iran to respond, manufacture a crisis chaotic enough that Trump could not sign a diplomatic agreement, while missiles were in the air over Tel Aviv, dragged the United States back into a confrontational posture toward Iran through deliberate Israeli provocation before the window for a deal could close. It nearly worked. Iran fired back. The region lurched toward full-scale war. If Trump had responded the way the hawkish wing of his own party wanted, with threats, with carrier group deployments, with a rhetoric of existential confrontation, the deal would be dead and Israel would have successfully torched it with a single precision airstrike on a building in Beirut. But Trump did not play his assigned role in that scenario, and that is the part of this story that changes the entire frame of what comes next. The phone call between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu in the hours after the missile strikes may be one of the most strategically significant private conversations an American president has had with an Israeli prime minister in decades. We do not have a transcript. We likely never will. But what leaked out of both sides within hours of the call's conclusion tells a remarkably coherent story. Netanyahu reportedly informed Trump that Israel intended to launch a massive attack on Iran. Trump reportedly informed Netanyahu that the United States would not participate. And then Trump said something that sounds, on the surface, like restraint, but is in practice an operational veto. He would not stop Israel either. He would simply withhold American support. Go ahead if you want, but you are on your own. That construction, I won't stop you, but I won't back you, is doing enormous work that most commentary has missed entirely, because Israel's ability to execute anything that could legitimately be described as a massive attack on Iran is almost entirely contingent on American logistical support, and specifically on access to American KC-135 aerial refueling tankers operating out of American bases in the Gulf. The distances involved in striking high-value targets deep inside Iranian territory from Israeli air bases require multiple air refuelings outbound and multiple refuelings on return, depending on the payload and flight profile. Israel has its own tanker aircraft, but nowhere near the numbers required to support the scale of operation that Netanyahu was apparently describing. Without American tankers, Israel's reach into Iran is dramatically curtailed. The massive retaliation becomes a limited, symbolic gesture. The crushing response becomes a manageable provocation. And the political damage that followed inside Israel was immediate and telling. Netanyahu's domestic opponents were on television within hours, calling for retaliation. Former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett characterized in Israeli political discourse as a moderate. To give you a sense of how far the Overton window has shifted, was openly declaring that Israel's sovereignty was at stake, and that a contained or symbolic response would signal to its enemies that Israeli blood was permitted. The domestic pressure on Netanyahu to respond with something overwhelming was real and significant, and yet the reports coming out of the Israeli government began to shift almost immediately from massive retaliation to the language of waiting, of striking at a time of Israel's choosing, of not wasting the response on a limited exchange. That is not strategic patience. That is a government that just ran the math and realized it does not have the operational capacity to do what it told the world it was going to do, building a narrative for why the massive strike is not happening tonight. Here is the part of this analysis that almost no one in American media is willing to say out loud with the directness it deserves. Iran is roughly 80 times the size of Israel. That is not a rhetorical device. That is a geographic and strategic reality with direct, measurable military implications. When Israeli officials and their American advocates talk about striking Iranian energy infrastructure, Iranian air bases, Iranian nuclear facilities, they are talking about hitting targets scattered across a landmass the size of Western Europe, a country with significant air defense systems, the capacity to harden and disperse critical infrastructure, and a military that has been specifically building and exercising in anticipation of exactly this kind of attack for the past 2 decades. You cannot do that effectively in one night of strikes. You cannot do it without a sustained air campaign of extraordinary logistical complexity that requires refueling, intelligence support, electronic warfare suppression, and the willingness to absorb losses over an extended operation. And you certainly cannot do it without the American assets that Trump just declined to make available. Flip the equation. What does Iran need to cause catastrophic damage to Israel? 2 major urban areas, several critical air bases, a handful of nuclear-adjacent sites in the Negev. Israel, for all its military sophistication, is geographically tiny. A determined adversary with ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drone swarms, and the backing of a Russian satellite intelligence network does not need a multi-week strategic air campaign to degrade Israeli military capacity significantly. They need accurate targeting data, which they have demonstrated they possess, and the political will to use their full arsenal. The asymmetry, once you strip away the assumption of unlimited American backing, does not favor Israel in a prolonged exchange with Iran. Israel's entire military doctrine has been built on that assumption. Remove it, and the strategic math transforms entirely. The former Israeli officials calling for strikes on Iran's power grid on live television the same night that Iranian missiles were landing on Israeli soil were either performing for their domestic audience or they genuinely have not done the arithmetic. Possibly both, because the moment Israel fires a massive strike at Iran, Iran fires back with everything against Israeli cities, against Israeli air bases, against American bases in the region simultaneously, because Iran has been explicit that American facilitation of Israeli strikes makes American targets legitimate. And Iran has spent 20 years building the missile inventory to make that threat real. The Houthi campaign out of Yemen taught the world something important that the Western military establishment has been remarkably slow to internalize. A relatively small force with cheap, precise, persistent missile and drone capability can shut down one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes on Earth and hold it shut for months. Iran is not Yemen. Iran is a nation-state with 80 million people, a large professional military, a sophisticated and expanding missile program, and intelligence partnerships with Russia and China that include, apparently, real-time targeting data on American classified assets. Anyone telling you this ends cleanly and quickly with an Israeli victory is not doing analysis, they are doing marketing. Now pull back and look at what is shifting around this conflict, because the bilateral Israel-Iran frame is too narrow for what is actually happening. Something significant is underway in terms of regional and global alignment, and the United States appears to be the last major power to fully process what it means. Pakistan has been quietly constructing one of the more consequential diplomatic architectures in recent Middle Eastern history. Pakistani officials have been in active contact with Iranian counterparts, Turkish counterparts, Egyptian counterparts. The head of the Lebanese military traveled to Pakistan. Pakistani sources have been describing with genuine confidence a framework towards something that could be called a regional military alignment, not a formal NATO-style treaty, but a meaningful strategic understanding among Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan that functions as a mutual security architecture anchored in shared identity and shared interest in limiting American and Israeli dominance over the region's political future. 4 countries, 2 nuclear powers, a combined population of several hundred million people, a collective military capacity that, operating in coordination, represents the most significant non-American, non-Israeli power bloc the Middle East has seen in generations, and China is the thread running through all of it. China brokered the Saudi-Iranian reconciliation in 2023, one of the most consequential diplomatic achievements of that decade, executed completely without American involvement, by a country whose regional ambitions the U.S. foreign policy establishment has consistently underestimated. China is now the effective patron of the Pakistan-Iran strategic relationship. China's satellite intelligence reportedly helped Iran find and destroy a billion-dollar American military asset in Bahrain. China has a direct and obvious strategic interest in demonstrating that American military presence in the Gulf is not invincible and not permanent. And China is doing it without firing a shot, without deploying a warship, and without any significant American media coverage of what it is actually accomplishing. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates, historically one of Israel's closest Gulf partners, a foundational signatory of the Abraham Accords, a country that has maintained careful, profitable ties with Tel Aviv while managing an uneasy peace with Tehran, was conspicuously absent from every Iranian threat statement following the missile strikes. Iran did not threaten Emirati targets. Iran did not mention American facilities in the UAE. The UAE issued no strong public statements of solidarity with Israel. That silence is a message in itself. The UAE is one of the most sophisticated geopolitical actors in the Gulf. They do not make mistakes of omission. They are reading the same shift that everyone with access to real intelligence is reading. They see which direction the regional wind is blowing. They see a deal potentially taking shape that would normalize American-Iranian relations and reshape the Gulf's power dynamics, and they are positioning themselves to not be caught on the losing side of that transition. Here is what all of this means for you. For ordinary Americans who are not watching this story because it is entertaining, but because they understand that American lives and American money are always the final collateral in Middle Eastern wars, that Washington sleepwalks into, every American service member at Al-Jadid, at Prince Sultan, at Al-Dhafra, at every installation across the Gulf theater is operating right now in an environment that has become demonstrably more dangerous, not because of Iranian irrationality, but because Iran has proven it has the intelligence, the targeting precision, and the political will to strike American assets directly and precisely. The diplomatic fiction that has historically provided American forces some insulation from Iranian retaliation, the idea that the United States and Israel are separate actors with separate decision-making, is being dismantled in real time, deliberately, by Iran, which is telling Washington in terms that could not be clearer, you are responsible for what your ally does. If Israel attacks us with American support, you are a target. The deal that Trump says is close, the framework that Pakistan has been quietly architecting, that China has been quietly underwriting, that Iran has been signaling genuine interest in that agreement, is the only thing standing between the current escalation and a war that would cost American lives at a scale we have not seen since the worst years of Iraq, cost American dollars at a scale that would accelerate every fiscal crisis already straining this country, and cost American credibility in the Muslim world in ways that would take a generation to begin to repair, and someone in the Israeli security establishment facing criminal prosecution at home and dependent on political extremists for coalition survival appears to have tried to destroy that deal by ordering a strike on a building in Beirut on a Sunday afternoon. And the question that America needs to be asking loudly, publicly, without diplomatic softening, is why the United States government has allowed its foreign policy to be this vulnerable to sabotage by a government whose leaders' political survival depends on permanent war. That is the question. That is the one that does not get asked on the Sunday shows. That is the one that gets you labeled and dismissed and talked over. But it is the right question. It is the only question that matters right now, and it is the one you deserve a real answer to. Subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video, because the only way this kind of coverage survives and reaches the people who need to hear it is if you make it happen. Leave a comment below, tell me whether you think the deal gets done, or whether Israel drags America into another war we did not vote for and cannot afford to fight. I will see you in the next one.